Well, my computer, which talks to that, which talks to that, which talks to something else. So we need to remember all of those, and there's the bell. And remember that. Let me start over. We need to remember all of those that are on our sick and injured list. Not going to try to name them all, but I am going to give you an update on Brother Terry. I talked to Janice yesterday, and she said that several things, but she also told me I could tell you some things that you don't know that's going on so everybody's on the same page. So the first thing she said was to tell everybody how much they appreciate the prayers and just to keep the prayers going because prayers work. One of the for instances is, and she couldn't recall the name or position of the people, but the doctor that did the surgery on Terry was the chief of the gastrointestinal field up there, so he was the best at what he did. And during Terry's surgery, I'm going to call him the director of medicine anyway, the big shot that was over all the school up there came into the operating room and assisted by helping him decide which vein to use, and said within an hour after they chose that particular vein and did things, it started pinkening up. So uh, prayers work. Brother Terry is home. He is still in a lot of pain. He still has a long way to go to recovery. He has a PICC line, and they're doing some nutrition by mouth and some by the, the line. The other thing, uh, he's going to have to make some small adjustments, and we don't know just what those are going to entail. And I might be giving you more information than you would like to know, but the human body, the small intestines, you know, everybody's different, so I'm just going to give you an approximate. But the small intestines, you have approximately 20 feet, plus or minus. When they do this kind of surgery, they like to leave a minimum of 6 feet. And with Brother Terry, they managed to save about 3 feet. So the doctor basically is going to want him to eat all day long instead of having 3 good meals and having time to process it all, just eat through the day. So those are some of the adjustments. Plus, he don't know what until he gets in better shape. He's not going to know what he can and can't eat, what will or won't bother him. So uh, the main thing that we need to do is just provide any support that we can to the family and keep the prayers going. Right, right. And when I've been around him, he wasn't able to eat much by mouth. So as the body heals and he's able to take more in the mouth, then he can get off the lines and all like that. So the main prayers are just that everything is intact, no leaks, and that he will have a comfortable recovery. But again, just keep him in our prayers. Uh, this is third Sunday. We're not having a fellowship meal today because of everything that went on before and after, but all the men uh, select a song or to lead a song or read a scripture or say a prayer. Be back at 5 o'clock tonight for that. If there's nothing else that we need to, Brother Jim Cox, would you lead us in a prayer, please? Amen. Galatians chapter 5. Galatians chapter 5. We've gone through the first 4 chapters rather rapidly, but that was to get us caught up. And I'm glad we didn't have to go faster on through this, because to me, chapter 5 is one of the key chapters in this book. It really gives us a lot of information that we can dive into. And as a matter of fact, I'm not sure that I'm even going to get all the way through it today. I hope I am. But if we start with verse 1, and I brought my computer today because I was doing a lot of highlighting, and there wasn't enough room in my Bible to make all the notes that I wanted to make sure that we paused on. So I might be a little bit slow with this. I'm not as fast with the computer as some of our younger folks are, but just bear with me. But starting in Galatians 5 and verse 1, the first 2 words to me grab you real hard around the neck if you're not careful. Stand fast. In Ephesians, there's the phrase, stand against the wiles of the devil. But what if you just look at the words stand fast, what does that mean to you? In our military day, be a rock. In our military days, it would be either hold, or stand. But stand fast, as Brother Cox said, is be a rock, be firm, be unwavering. So Paul starts out this particular, what we call chapter now of this letter, with stand fast, be unwavering, therefore in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free. If you will look at Romans 6 and verse 18, when it comes to liberty, then being then made free from sin to become the servants of righteousness. So we are to stand fast, freed us from the world, but the stand that we're to take is for righteousness. And then the next part of it is be not entangled again. What would that phrase mean? Be not entangled again. What is something if you get it tangled up? I'm sorry? Caught up in. If any of you ever fish and you have a backlash and you just have a tangle, you know you got a real mess. And so don't get caught up in, don't get entangled in. Jeff is grinning because he's done it more than once, right? Me too. So you don't get entangled, or you don't get wrapped up in it again. But what are you not to get wrapped up in? Sin, the yoke of bondage. If you'll go to Acts 15 and 10, now therefore, why tempt ye God to put a yoke upon the neck of the disciples, which neither our father nor we were able to bear? So if you take that verse in context with what we're looking at, what was happening to the people in Galatia? What kind of bondage was trying to be put upon them at that time? Old Testament, back to Judaism. So here, Paul is telling them to stand fast. You've been freed from that. Don't let them mess with you, and don't get tangled up in that yoke again. Yoke and bondage is 2 pretty serious words. What do you think of when you think of a yoke? A cow, and where can that cow go with a yoke on its neck? Can't go where it wants to. It can only go where you take it. And with bondage in there, I think of the England back in the Middle Ages when they would put them in stocks. They'd have a yoke around their neck and they wasn't going anywhere. So that to me is like the yoke of bondage. Verse 2, Paul says, well, let me get there. I might have to get some smart guy up here to help me with this. Verse 2 says, this is Paul, I say unto you that if you be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. Now, wait a minute. Where was Christ teaching first? Wasn't all the true Jews circumcised? So what does he mean here by it'll profit you nothing by being circumcised? Pardon? Who's Paul writing to? This letter. Galatians. Who were the Galatians? Gentiles. So Paul is continuing with that first verse saying, you don't let them tangle you up in this. You don't have to do this. If you do, it's of no benefit to you. So he is trying to separate the old from the new way through here. And the Jews were trying to bind all the converts to the old law and then move into the new law. And in verse 3, he said, for I testify again to every man that is circumcised that he is a debtor to the whole law. See, all this builds on itself. Don't get back into it. It's of no benefit if you're going to be leaving Christ, be a Christian. And here he says that all those that were circumcised, it was what the Jew was supposed to do, which in essence bound them to the law. So he's saying, if you do this, then you're under the yoke of the law. You don't need to be under the yoke of the law. So, like I say, he's just sort of going around this. That anybody that would do that, they're trying to bind themselves to the old law of Moses. Questions, comments so far? You don't have any? In verse 4, Christ is become of no effect. In other words, what does no effect mean? If something is not effective, what? Doesn't change a thing. In other words, it's rendered inactive, idle, useless. So Christ is useless unto you, whosoever of you are justified by the law, being, again, the Mosaical law, that those who tried to go back and fulfill the law of Moses. Can you tell me how many people under the law, under the Mosaical law, was justified? And who was that one? Christ. And it was Christ's blood then that justified every Jew that had ever lived that had been obedient to that law, and to every Christian forward. So he's saying that, if you try to do this, if you try to go back into the old way, you are fallen from grace. If we bring that up into today's terms, there are multiple religions out there that want to use once saved, always saved. And if you point out somebody that has gone back into the way of sin, their comments are generally, well, they was never really converted. They wasn't a believer in the first place. So they never take it to the level that they were in God's good grace and then fell. But what does this plainly tell us right here? Christ came along, we taught you, you became a Christian, and now if you go back the other way, you are fallen from God's grace. It does not put us on a always basis. Yes, sir. Right. You can come back once you get your head back on straight. Yes, sir. I'm sorry? Well, apparently somebody has told them something and got them convinced. Verse 5 then says, "For we, through the Spirit, wait for the hope of righteousness by faith." We who are Christians, we, meaning we who are Christians, through the Spirit, meaning the Holy Spirit, we only expect salvation how? Through Christ. A hope of righteousness. In other words, where is our hope for salvation? Same place it's always been since 33 AD, whichever one you want to put on it. The only hope of salvation is through Christ. And right. Correct. They had no hope other than, they could not be justified other than by faith in and through the Redeemer, Christ. Verse 6 tells us, "For in Jesus Christ neither circumcision availeth anything, nor uncircumcision, but faith which worketh by love." You see, the design of Christianity was to abolish all the rites and ceremonies and festivals and observances that the Jews had, and to introduce the way of salvation that is applied to all mankind. And Paul's having a tough time with it because of all of this going on. Again, questions or comments through 6? So soon removed, yes, sir. That's correct. We're going to get to 11 in a little bit, but that's a great point there, that it doesn't take the whole all law to mess you up, but just a tiny portion of doing it wrong will mess you up. Yeah, because if we go back to verse 1, we can have the yoke of bondage today, not necessarily the Old Testament, but we can be under the yoke of bondage of anything out there in the world that gets us away from what we're supposed to be doing. Verse 7 puts it, as Paul has done before, ye did run well. Like I say, this is nothing new. He's compared Christians to a race several times, but you did run well. And then he puts in the phrase, who did hinder you that you should not obey the truth? The words here used for hinder means properly, in the context, to drive back or beat back. By hindering, you're not just encouraging, but you're being more forceful in it. So who is driving you back from the truth, that you should not obey the truth? Obstruction. Good word. So to obey the truth, did they know the truth? Paul had taught them the truth, but now somebody is interfering with them on that. Verse 8 says, this persuasion, not of him that called you. So Paul is the one that called them. Paul was the one that went to them and preached to them and established everything. So it wasn't coming from Paul, it was coming from somebody else. It is, they were teaching them that it was necessary to obey the law of Moses. This gets back to your Judaizers, before they could get into Christianity. And he's telling them that they were trying to intermingle the old and the new, which should not be done. It was Christ that, Paul was the messenger, but it was Christ that called them to this. Brother Jeremy. Right. How often do we bring our old life into this and try and make it work? I think that is the lesson for us today. When you become a Christian, that's what it means to crucify the old man. All of that, the hindrances, the things that we used to do are no longer compatible. But how often do we go back and try to pick up that lifestyle or those habits or whatever? And see, this is particularly difficult for people who come to Christ later in age, because where have they been surrounded for all those informative years? Who are their close associates? Who are their friends? And even a friend that might not be trying to do you harm, they might be as good as gold, but if they're not on the same page with you as being a Christian, they hadn't changed their lifestyle. So they could be an encouragement to you to go back to, as Brother Jeremy said, back into the old way of life. I've used me a lot. Jeff fishes a lot. I have friends that I fished with all the time. But I had already been a Christian before I got to know these folks. And they knew that I wasn't going fishing on Sunday morning or Sunday evening. I was going to be at church. If we went fishing on Sunday, it was going to be after services were over. And they never encouraged me to do any different. I take that they respected me. I asked them on almost every occasion to come to church. They never did, but I kept asking. And so it is very, very difficult to break that friendship, that bond. But when a person becomes a Christian, and I'm not saying this as some people are going to point and say, well, you're making this out to be a cult. No, absolutely not. But when you become a Christian, you need to surround yourselves with Christians to get that influence rather than the old influence. Nothing cultish about it. Common sense. You're grinning at me. You're grinning at me. Anything to add? Okay. I'm missing part of this. Common sense? Well, yeah. No. If once we become a Christian and become faithful, the more you're ingrained in it, the easier it is to make those decisions. Huh? Hang on. Well, let me do it this way. When I became a Christian, my folks were unfaithful. Most of you know the story about how I became a Christian. Invited to go to a meeting, or I asked where they were going. They said, to a meeting. You want to go with us? And I had some contact with the church before this. My grandparents went, and I would go to them, but it was never anything, no serious study or anything like that. But during that meeting, I knew what needed to be done, and I did it. I didn't do it that night. I went home and told my folks, I said, tomorrow night I'm going to be baptized. Not a word was said. Not a word. Went to bed that night, got up, did my routine during the day, and that night when I started getting ready to go to the meeting, came downstairs, my dad, my mom, my grandmother, my grandfather, they were all dressed up to go to church. We used to dress up back in those days. We all went to church, to the building. I went forward to be baptized. They went forward to be restored. From that moment forward, when it came time to what we call church, there was never a discussion about what we're going to do today. We're going to go to church, or we're going to do this, or we're going to do that. It was automatic. So that's why I say it gets a little easier. But I think where the line is once a person knows who you are, they're going to stop trying to influence you, and they will respect you for that, and you can still be associates with them. The line to me is drawn where you don't let them draw you back into the old way. Don't let them discourage you from doing what you know is the right thing to do. And as long as you do that, you can still fish with them, be associates with them. But if you start fellowshipping with them on Sunday morning, Sunday evening, and not being where you're supposed to, that's where you get off path. Is that? It does, and I think this next verse is going to play a long way into what you're talking about. Absolutely. You're quoting a verse from my lesson today, or from my sermon, but that's good. Yes, sir. This next verse to me sort of puts everything in its true perspective. A little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. How many of you in here, I won't say are cooks, but how many of you in here know how to cook? All right. What does leaven do? Makes the bread rise. How much does it take? Just a little bit. Andrea, when we was given what was called a starter, some of you ladies may know that phrase, to make sourdough bread. And she could make it daily. And she could take, when this loaf was ready, or when this dough was ready, you rip off a section of it, put it back in the jar. Next day, a little more. And leaven is a live thing. And it feeds off of sugar, the stuff that, in other words, when you tear off this little bit and put it into the whole lump and let the whole lump sit there for a while, that leaven is not contaminating, it's feeding off of that and growing. So if you look at everything in context here, where he's going, the people that want to hinder you from doing things, a little leaven, and he goes back sometimes to the Pharisees and all, it just keeps permeating. It's alive. It just keeps growing and growing and growing. As long as it has something to feed on, it grows. What causes something like a starter to die, or a clump of leaven to die? It's never introduced to anything fresh. When it consumes all there is for it to consume, it dies. But as long as it is put into other stuff, it just keeps eating and growing. And I think that, to me, puts that into perfect context. Don't associate with this bunch of leaven over here. They're leading you wrong. Separate yourself. Do the right thing. Any questions, comments, or did that make any sense on that? Brother Golden, you got your hand? Yes, sir. Correct. Yeah. And we can go to the passage that says, if you're in the city and nobody will shake the dust off your, does that mean forget them? No, it just means to move on. If you have opportunity to go back later, but yeah. So any other comments, questions in dealing through verse 9? And it's getting worse by the day, shall we say. When I was a youngster, our first TV set had 2 channels on it. We could watch both. No, we could watch both of them. And it had a remote control. Dad'd say, Larry, go change channels. Could watch both of them. Today, I hadn't counted, but I think we've got access to 60 plus channels. Some people that pay more, people that pay attention, pay for all the tiers and everything, got access to over 100 channels. Of all the channels that I have access to, I can still only watch about 3 or 4 of them. If I watch a movie on this channel, they have cut out all the bad language and everything else, and it's okay. If I watch that same movie on this channel over here, I made that mistake one day for about 5 minutes, and I had to. So the outside influence of the world is getting to us in more and more and more ways. I ain't even going to talk about the computer. Yeah, yes, sir. And that goes back to the verse that Brother Culp used. We are to grow in grace and knowledge. So, okay. Absolutely. Well, when they invented the TV and put it out in the public, do you know what the number one reason for it coming into existence was? For news. But now it's entertainment. Well, today it's more editorializing than news, but I mean, you got to watch 6 stations to get all their views, and then you have to draw it down to, okay, what was the news in here? So, but verse 10 then says, I have confidence in you through the Lord. This is Paul saying that even though I'm on your case right now, I still have confidence in you that ye will be none otherwise minded, but he that troubleth you will bear his judgment, whosoever he be. So here Paul is letting them know that I've got confidence that you're going to do the right thing. Now the person that's trying to hinder you, it's all on him. Don't matter who he is, it's on that person. And in verse 11, he said, and I, brethren, if I yet preach circumcision, why do I yet suffer persecution? Paul never taught circumcision. So he's sort of using a mix up here, saying, if I did that, why am I still being fussed at by this group? He suffered persecution under the Jews after he was converted because he was teaching Christianity. Why were the Jews after him? If he had been teaching that they had to be converted to Judaism and then mingle it with Christianity, the Jews wouldn't have been fussing at him. But he was separating the two, saying, I didn't do it. That's why they're still after me or still on my case. And then he said, then is the offense of the cross ceased. Verse 12, I would that they were even cut off, which trouble you. He's simply saying here that I wish you wasn't been bothered with this. Luke's about to ring the bell, and I'm not even halfway through. Well, about halfway. But verse 13, for brethren, ye have been called unto liberty, only use not liberty for an occasion to the flesh, but by love serve one another. God's called them into liberty. He's freed them from the old way. He's shown them the new way. And now we're not to go back and do things that please the flesh, but we are to serve one another and do that which is righteous. Verse 14, for all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. That's the second part of something, that we are to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, mind, strength. And the second is like unto it, love thy neighbor. So everything here, the one word that he's referring to is what? Love. You love God, you love your neighbor, work toward those good goals, and leave everything else alone. Verse 15, but if ye bite and devour one another, take heed that you be not consumed one of another. The idea here is that in their contentions, they would destroy each other's spirituality, ruin their character. The church would be overthrown. You see, what is the easiest way for a church to be spiritually destroyed? That little leaven, but in what manner? I just give it to you there. Don't be contentious with one another, backbiting, gossip. That will destroy a church, a congregation. Yeah. There are more churches that have splits, not over spiritual issues, but over personalities than any other thing, because people won't get along. What I changed my phrasing there from can't to won't. So we can if we put our mind to it and do it. This I say then, walk in the Spirit, and ye shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. That is relatively a simple statement, but look how much meaning it has. If you consume your time with this, there is no time for that. And that cup is going to be full one way or the other. When water starts evaporating out of a cup, you can pour more water into it, but something is going in that cup, good or bad. So, and I look at it this way, and I've used this example many times before, but the brain is nothing but a sponge. And what do you do with a sponge? If you put it in water, what's it doing? It's either absorbing, or when it gets full, it stays full. When you put it out on the dry ground, what does it do? It starts shrinking. So your mind, if you focus on the Bible and what God's telling us to do, the more of this you input, the less room there is for anything else. And if you get away from it, you're never static. You're always growing or receding. So the thing to do is stay in touch with it. And again, that goes back, I'm not using it that particular way, but it goes back to, again, that verse that Brother Culp used. We're to grow in knowledge. Verse 17, for the flesh lusteth after the Spirit and the Spirit against the flesh, and these are contrary one to another, so that you cannot do the things that you would. Very simply, is we've already stated that. It's one or the other. Something is going to be there. What's your choice and what's it going to be? Verse 18, but if you're led by the Spirit, you're not under the law. The old law was nailed to the cross. If you're under the Spirit, if you're under Christ, you have nothing to do with the old law. Now, it was the schoolmaster, it was the teacher. There's things we need to know there, but we are under Christ. We're led by the Spirit. Correct. Correct. We are bound by the new law if we are a Christian. And then the rest of the chapter I can get finished today, because the rest of the chapter, no, I can't. We'll pick up here Wednesday night, Lord willing. Thank y'all so much for your comments and your attention.